Hello, and welcome back to the Secular Homeschool Revolution. This podcast is for secular progressive homeschoolers who are reimagining their kids' education unapologetically. I'm Ashley, your host, and today we are decolonizing the 4th of July. I'm going to be honest, and if you're new, welcome. If you're not, you pretty much know that I am not interested in teaching my kids a fairy tale version of freedom. I'm not interested in coloring flags or singing patriotic songs or pretending that 1776 meant liberation for everybody, because it didn't. When this country declared independence, Black people were still enslaved. Indigenous people were being pushed off their land, and women had no power, no political power, and poor people were disposable. And the men writing about liberty were denying it to everybody else. So no, we're not doing the America was born free and innocent over here because we are, we're teaching our kids to ask the question. So what is the question that needs to be asked here? And the question is, free, who was free and free for who? Because again, we are raising kids who can think critically, challenge injustice, and understand the world beyond propaganda. And we have to stop teaching national myths as history. So today we're going to talk about the 4th of July and what it really represents and why it needs to be taught through a decolonized lens and how it connects to what we're seeing right now in this country and how secular progressive homeschoolers can give our kids a bigger, more honest understanding of freedom, the truth. So let's get into it. And before we get into it, make sure you like and follow, subscribe, and review. And if you like the work here, please buy me a coffee. I'll have the link in my show notes. So let's dive in. So let's start with decolonizing the 4th of July and what that means. I know we like to throw around the term like, I want to teach them honest history or decolonize history or the truth. And how we're going to do that with the 4th of July. I want to start by saying that by decolonizing 4th of July does not mean that we are bitter and mad and trying to ruin everybody's barbecue. No, we just want history to be taught in an expanded worldview, have everyone and acknowledge where everyone was at and what the language meant at that time, because it does still deeply impact us today. So some people are only comfortable when history is decorated in its patriotism of red, white, and blue. But the truth is, 4th of July has just been, and like we're going into our 250-year anniversary, right? So it's been packaged as like this birthday of American freedom, when really it's the birthday of a country that declared freedom while actively denying it to millions of people. And that is not a small detail. It does not get erased, because that is the foundation. When the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, this country was not free. It was free for a very specific group of people, mostly white men with property, power, and access. Because the Black people, where were they at in the story? They were enslaved. Where were the Indigenous people, right? Because we want to teach our kids to ask for these people. Indigenous people were facing invasion, displacement, and violence. Women were excluded from political life. Whether you were white or Black, it was period. You were not in the conversation. And poor people were wildly exploited. And the land being claimed as a new nation was not empty. It was not discovered. It was not a gift. It was already home to Indigenous nations. They had languages and government and cultures and spiritual practices and trade routes and agriculture and relationships to the land that existed long before the U.S. imagined itself into existence. So when we teach the kids that July 4th, 1776 was the day we became free, we need to pause and specifically say, who is we? Because that we is doing a whole lot of work. It's erasing Black people. It's erasing Indigenous nations. It's erasing Mexicans, Mexican Americans, and the borderland histories. And it erases enslaved labor and stolen land and broken treaties and generations of people who had to fight to be included in a freedom story that they were never meant to be a part of, or the freedom they were never meant to experience. And this is where progressive homeschoolers get to shine and do it right. Because if we're still teaching the 4th of July is clean and heroic and a birthday party, we are not teaching critical thinking. We are doing a terrible job in teaching propaganda. And I don't care if you feel like that was harsh. It's the truth, because a lot of homeschool curriculum and even secular curriculum tells the American story from the top down, from the founding fathers, the brave colonists, red coats, independence, freedom. And yeah, that is part of the story, but it is not the whole story, and that is not everybody's story. So a decolonize approach asks, who was missing from the room? Who was forced to build the economy? Who was removed from the land? Who was called savage so colonization could look civilized? And who was told that they had to wait for their freedom? And who was punished for demanding it? And this is where we get to define the difference between teaching history and teaching nationalism. Because history gives kids context. Nationalism shoves it down their throat and basically gives a script. And nationalism, you are demanding loyalty. And if you know history, then you know to ask questions. And as secular progressive homeschoolers, we should not be afraid of our kids asking better questions than we were allowed to ask, right? We want them to do better than us, to know more than us, because the goal is not to raise kids who blindly copycat and repeat things. We don't want them to blindly say America is the greatest country in the world based off propaganda. And that is not, anti-American. I think that's the most American thing we can do, is offer our kids history and give them context and complexity, and again push them to ask questions. We want them to look at a country and look at the system, the laws, and the tradition, and say who benefits from the story, who was harmed, who and what truth is being left out. And that's what decolonizing education looks like. It does not mean we remove the joy, and it does not mean we never gather and celebrate. It does not mean we can't grill or swim or connect with family or watch fireworks, if that's what your family chooses to do. But it does mean we have to stop pretending celebration and critique cannot exist at the same time, because they can. You can enjoy a day off and still tell the truth. You can sit at the cookout and be like me and rain on everybody's parade. But you can still do it and enjoy yourself and know that this country was built on contradictions. And you can let your kids eat watermelon and run through the sprinklers and wear the Old Navy shirts if you want. I don't, but if that's what you want to do. But I do think they can handle more than the colonists wanted freedom. I think we can rephrase that and say some colonists wanted freedom from Britain, but they also wanted to deny freedom from other people, and explain who were those other people. Freedom in this country has always been fought for by people who were told they did not deserve it. And I think the bigger question is, I think adults are the problem, because they always wonder, can my kid handle the truth? And I think sometimes adults struggle with how to process that information themselves. And so they struggle with giving it to their kids. And adults are the ones who want history softened. Adults are the ones who want to present the prettier version of history. And the adults are the ones who are always saying, well, they're too young. And, just say you don't want to sit with it or say you don't want to go down that journey. But because we're secular, progressive homeschoolers, we are taking the opportunity to do something different. And we don't have to wait on a school board to approve it or wait for a textbook company to come out with something. And we know that these patriotic unit studies are full of propaganda, and we're going to choose better. So what that means is we are teaching our kids that 4th of July is not the beginning of freedom. It is the beginning of one version of America's freedom story. And that version left a lot of people out, and they think those people, us, should be grateful for the crumbs. But we are more responsible than that, and we're going to teach them that freedom is much bigger than 1776. We're going to talk about slave rebellions, indigenous resistance, abolitionist movements, Juneteenth. We just had a Juneteenth episode. If you haven't listened to it, go back and do it. What mutual aid and labor organizing and what the civil rights marches do, and disability justice and queer liberation and immigrant families refusing to disappear, and student walkouts and parents just be supportive, because we owe that to our kids. We owe that to America, that this is the America our kids need to study, and not the polished pretty one, but the honest, truthful conversation that they deserve. So if you're going to decolonize the 4th of July, one of the first places I want you to go to is look up is Frederick Douglass. And I want you to look for the speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. I want you to print it out. I want you to read parts of it with your kids. I want you to listen to the audio version together. I want you to pause. I want you to talk about it. I want it to resonate, and I want them to hear the weight of the words. Because Frederick Douglass did not give us a soft critique. He gave us direct confrontation. And in 1852, Douglass, when he was invited to speak about 4th of July, he gave people a patriotic speech that forced them to face the truth. And how can a country celebrate liberty while holding millions of Black people in bondage? And that question is not outdated. It still hurts. It cuts deeply, because Douglass was not just talking about fireworks and flags. He was talking about the hypocrisy this country was built on. He was talking about a nation that loved the language of freedom, but refused to practice it for everyone. And he called it out in such an intentional way. And that is exactly the kind of contradiction our kids need to learn how to recognize, because America is very good at propaganda and beautiful words, and they love to use freedom and liberty and justice and equality and opportunity. But who gets access to those words? And that's what we have to teach our homeschool kids. Who gets protected by freedom? Who gets threatened in the name of freedom? Who gets to be grateful? Who is forced to be grateful for the crumbs that they were given? Who gets to told that they have to wait for their freedom? And this is exactly what Frederick Douglass was exposing. He was saying, in plain terms, your celebration is not my celebration, and your freedom is not my freedom. And that national pride that you're feeling means something very different to my people who are still enslaved. And that is the lesson, because the 4th of July looks very different depending on where you're standing. And if you're standing inside the story as someone who benefited from the independence, I'm sure you feel prideful. I get it. I would too. But if you are standing as someone whose ancestors were enslaved, displaced, erased, colonized, or just excluded, it can feel like grief and anger. And it could feel like, how are you asking me to celebrate a freedom that was never meant for me? And our kids do need to know that. They need to know that history is not, a one-way street. It's not a flat story. And what everybody experienced, not everyone experiences US's version of freedom the same way. And real history does ask us to hold multiple truths at once. Yes, the colonies declared the independence from Britain, and Black people were still enslaved. Yes, people talked about liberty, and Indigenous people were being pushed off their land. Yes, people celebrated a new nation, and that nation was being built on stolen land and stolen labor. And we have to sit in that tension, and we should not rush to resolve it just because it makes adults uncomfortable. And when I say rush to resolve it, that means we don't need to rush through the lesson. Like, it's important. Let it sit beyond just 4th of July. And I get this speech might be a little hard to do with younger kids, but older elementary, middle school, and high school students can absolutely engage with the passages. And listen to the audio again, because hearing it read aloud gives it a different kind of power. And let your kids hear the emotion and the urgency, and then ask them, what emotion was Douglass feeling? Was he happy? Was he angry? Who do you think he was speaking to? Who does he refuse, or why does he refuse to celebrate the 4th of July the way white Americans were celebrating it? And what does he want us to understand? What would this speech sound like if someone gave a version of it today? And don't try to coach their answers. Just let them answer, in their words. So it's okay if they don't have like a long, articulate explanation and they're just saying, wow, that's messed up, because it is. We can connect 1776 to current events, and it's not just old history, because we are living in a moment where the language of freedom is still being used selectively. So, for instance, we hear people talk about freedom when they mean the freedom to ban books. When we hear people say parental rights, they're using it to attack LGBTQIA plus students and to erase honest history. And when we hear law and order, that's used to target immigrant families and to detain them and separate them. And right now, immigration enforcement and ICE protests are a part of the national conversation. And in 2026, there have been protests connected to ICE activity and detention conditions, and including demonstrations in places like Newark and Hartford, right? And there has been a study by the Mayor's poll that says they conducted it in February of 2026, and it found that 65% of Americans said ICE actions have gone too far in enforcing immigration laws. So when we teach the 4th of July, we cannot pretend the question of freedom has been settled, because our kids are watching what freedom looks like in real time, and we can't ignore that they aren't picking up on that. And it helps when we give them language to name it, because they're seeing who's getting protected, who's getting punished. They're seeing whose histories get celebrated and who's getting banned right now. And they're watching on how this country responds to Black grief, Indigenous sovereignty, queer families, immigrant communities, disabled people, poor people, and people overall who are just demanding justice. So when we say freedom, we need to ask freedom for who, under what conditions, and at what expense. And this is that expanded worldview that our kids need. So how do we teach the 4th of July differently? What does that look like in homeschooling? That doesn't mean like throw away the whole day. I mean, we don't celebrate it at my house, but to each their own. Um, you know, and you also don't have to be the buzzkill parent, at the cookout, giving 2-hour lectures and judging everyone while you're still trying to flip some burgers. But you can be intentional, and you can say that today is the day many Americans celebrate independence from Britain, but not everyone in America was free in 1776. And I think that one sentence changes a lot, especially and I think that's a very patriot thing to do. For younger kids, say some people were celebrating freedom, but other people were still being treated unfairly. So we remember that freedom should be for everyone. And for older kids, dig deeper, look at who is included in the Declaration of Independence, who is excluded. What does it mean when a country says it believes in liberty, but practices slavery and colonization? And I like timelines. I think timelines make sense in explaining history. So you could compare timelines. You could start with the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and then look at the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Look at when Frederick Douglass gave his speech in 1852. Look at Juneteenth in 1865, and when women had the right to vote in 1920. Look at the Voting Rights Acts of 1965, then all the way to today over the ongoing fights for voting rights and immigration and book bans and body autonomy and queer rights and education. I feel like this timeline will help kids see that freedom has never been just one single act or just one single moment in history, that it has been an ongoing journey and it has always been contested. So what are some activities that you can do to decolonize your 4th of July? Something I'm planning to do with my kids is create a Freedom for Who chart. So one side, write down who benefited from independence in 1776, and on the other side, write who was excluded. Every year for like the last 4 years, we always read Frederick Douglass' speech. Well, actually, we're huge fans in my house of Frederick Douglass, so excuse me, it's not something they're new to. They're true to this. And ask, with the speech, what is he challenging people to see? Another thing you can do is the Zen Education Project has a resource. They offer free people's history lessons and materials for educators that center voices that are left out of traditional textbooks, and that's on Zen Education. And instead of making, flag crafts, make a mural or a poster around the question, what does real freedom require? Who should be included in the conversation? And for those families who still celebrate fireworks and food, add some reflection, because before the fun, name the truth and say we can enjoy being together today and still acknowledge the truth about this country. And I think that offers you some balance, and I think joy and honesty can sit at the same table. So what does 4th of July mean for Black, Brown, and Indigenous families? Because I know 4th of July can feel real complicated because of this country's freedom story. And it always excludes us, but has always depended on our labor and our culture and resistance and survival. So for Indigenous families, the 4th of July can represent the celebration of a nation built through land that was stolen and broken treaties that happened within their communities. For Mexican and Mexican-American families, especially here in Texas, the story of America cannot be separated from borders and colonization and stolen land, language suppression, and the constant demand to prove belongings. And for immigrant families right now, I know freedom can feel conditional. I know it's a lot of paperwork and policing, and there's a lot of fear going around on social media and television and the laws they're trying to pass. And, you feel like you're under surveillance. And I know it's a lot of political talking points that are happening, and I'm so sorry. And we can acknowledge that. And I think these are great points to understand on why we cannot teach this holiday as if everyone is standing in the same relationship to the flag, because we're not. Some people see the flag and feel the pride. Some people see the American flag and they feel grief, and some people feel both. Our kids are capable of holding that complexity, and I think they're better at holding it than adults are. So what should allies do? I think I want to address allies because oftentimes in conversation, I think there's a level of guilt happening. And when the guilt happens, I think there's centering that happens. And I don't want you to center yourself. I don't think guilt is not the goal. The goal is to have an honest conversation and truth. I think responsibility is the goal, and your responsibility is have the honest conversation. And the action is having the conversation. And don't just say, oh, it was so terrible. I want you to dive into the books, ask the questions, research whose voices are centered and who was left out. And again, Black freedom isn't always just through slavery, and teaching Indigenous people in past tense is reckless. So stop saying we when talking about the founding fathers unless you're willing to say we when talking about harm. And please don't make your kids color a flag and you're like, oh, we had a great social studies lesson. I want you to give them context. I want you to give them truth. And you need to give them tools to understand the country that they live in, because allyship in education is not about having the right bookshelf aesthetic. It is about what are you willing to disrupt? So this 4th of July, whether you celebrate, reflect, opt out, barbecue, read, rest, protest, or just try to survive the fireworks with your kids, I want to invite you to ask one question in your homeschooling experience, education that you're providing for your kids. What does freedom mean if it is not for everybody? And I think this question alone can open the door to deeper learning, because decolonizing the 4th of July is not about hating America, but it is about refusing to teach our kids a version of America that requires us to have amnesia. And it's about giving them a worldview big enough to understand that freedom is more than a date. It's not a flag. It's not a song. It's not a slogan, but it is responsibility. Freedom is a responsibility. And if we are raising kids who can think critically and care deeply and challenge injustice, then we are doing more than teaching history. We are preparing them to build something better. So thank you. Thank you for doing this work with me. This has been the Secular Homeschool Revolution, the podcast for secular progressive homeschoolers who are reimagining their kids' education unapologetically. Please like, follow, subscribe. Follow me on Instagram. It's Secular Homeschool Revolution. On TikTok, Secular Homeschool Revolution. Share this episode with another homeschool parent or community who's ready to, decolonize the textbook version of history. And until next time, keep questioning, keep reimagining, and keep teaching the truth unapologetically, because that is the revolution.